Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you the third part in our key look at the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. We've already covered the build-up towards the battle, the initial actions in the first couple of months of the campaign, and now moving on to the later actions and a look into the aftermath once the entire campaign was finally completed. As always, it's important to stress this is a lesson catered towards the student level, so it'll be introductory in nature, containing key knowledge with some dedicated practice towards historical skills towards the end. If you've not already, do make sure you watch the first couple parts in this video series. They will prove useful for you as we go forward and learn about the rest of the campaign. So, notepads and pens at the ready, let us begin. The first thing to do is to quickly remind ourselves what the situation is like once we get to the start of September in 1917. And these are some problems that occurred for the British in those initial months in July and especially August. First off, we had a bit of conflict with the British leadership between what they desired. We had some, like Haig and Gough, who were desiring a breakthrough, pushing through their objectives and hoping to take lots of land, take lots of railways, and hopefully rout the German army in the north, in the Flanders area. However, on the other side, we have more cautious leadership, for instance, the likes of Rawlinson and especially Plumer, who wanted more of a bite and hold strategy to take small chunks of land, consolidate holding it, and then, when the soldiers were healed and ready, could then push on for the next objective. And in the middle were the politicians, the ones who were really siding with Plumer's idea of a bite and hold, but were buying into Haig's promises of a breakthrough and willing to take another gamble, despite what the likes of Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, was saying. A second big problem was the strength of the Germans, despite the attritional disasters at the Somme for them, losing over 1 million men there and at Verdun. They actually were proving quite successful. Hindenburg's defense in depth strategy was proving difficult to break. Whenever they did take some lines, they were counter-attacking. The pillboxes and bunkers were quite secure in the Passchendaele and Flanders area. And because they had divided their troops up into those trench garrisons and counter-attacking stormtroopers, it meant it was really difficult to really penetrate deep. It's why only around 3 kilometers was gained in that first month of the battle. This was also really tempered by the bad weather. All the rain that was occurring, the fact that Gough's initial bombing campaign destroyed the sewer system in the area, which basically flooded the area with loads of sewage. It was essentially a quagmire, really difficult to traverse, which also made it really difficult for tanks to progress as well. And the soldiers, when they were trying to climb up the big hills on the salients, they were only falling down, they were struggling to run quickly, and essentially left open for sniper and machine gun fire. So it wasn't really an ideal set of conditions for the British going into September, which is why Haig finally had to relent and allow Plumer to take full control again. Because remember, Plumer had initially been the leader of this objective. He'd been the man who had the most experience here. He showed extreme success at Messines Ridge, only at the start of the campaign, before he was forcefully replaced and Gough was given most of the command. Now he was going to get a chance again. And as we said in the last video, the key question here is, will there be change? Will the British learn from their errors again? Will they overcome the difficulties that the Germans are throwing at them? So Passchendaele between August and November in 1917. What was happening once we get to this point? Well, first off, we actually have key change in the weather. Once we get to September, a lot of the rain and the quagmire situation they were facing was finally going to dry up. And this was a key thing for them. They were finally going to get a chance to really initiate some good attacks and make some good breakthroughs. One of the first major ones that Plumer managed to succeed in was at Menin Road Ridge between September 20th and 27th. Now, why was this so successful? Well, it was so successful because Plumer was now having the freedom to initiate his bite and hold strategy. A quick reminder of what bite and hold is. It's this idea where rather than pushing for miles of land in a single attack, Plumer was containing them to only short steps, roughly 1,000 to 1,500 yards at a time. For a conversion, this is about 1 mile. Now, why is 1 mile so important? Well, it's because it was the perfect distance that the artillery could still accurately fire into. This is important because, as we established at the Somme, a big reason the creeping barrage was so successful was because it was combining infantry action with artillery bombardment. And now, because they were doing it once again in this secured manner, they could allow its soldiers to secure small gains of ground over a long stretch of time. But the key thing was allowing regular rest as well. The reason Gough's attacks were failing because they were relentlessly pushing for an offensive, which only made it easy for the German assault teams to counterattack and take their positions. So, by allowing for this rest, they could move their artillery up in the position and then attack again to take another mile with full artillery and infantry support. Therefore, because they were doing this, the German counterattacks were easier to prevent. It was going to be a slow slog, but this carefully planned series of attacks would also pay dividends elsewhere. For instance, the very next week at Polygon Wood, Anglo-Canadian forces were able to take that position as well in the space of only 5 to 7 days. And Brudstein on the 4th of October also could fall to their position. However, we can't overlook the fact that casualties were still going to be a major player in this. Despite their successes, despite this strategy working, it's important to remember it was still an attritional campaign. Reminder, of course, of attrition. This is in effect, the churning of many young men committing to the offensive over a long period of time. It was working. They were going to successfully take their objectives by November, but the reality was many men were still going to be wounded and, in worst cases, be killed in the combat. It all came to a head in November when the Canadian forces made a big push and captured the village of Passchendaele on November 6, 1917. This marked the official end to the campaign because by this point we have to understand the winter is fully setting in, which makes it very difficult, much like it happened at the Somme, to take any more ground over the following months. Haig's forces had advanced no more than 10,000 yards, which is roughly 9 kilometers in distance. They hadn't really achieved all their objectives that they had set on the first day, especially those railway networks that they wanted to control to get up to the northern port towns. The advances simply made the Ypres salient even more precarious to not only attack, but also defend and hold this ground as well. I want to also briefly note an offensive that happened shortly after in the interim as well in November. Haig actually authorised another attack, this time at a place called Cambrai. Why do I want to note this one? Well, because this was a massive tank battle. We haven't really seen one of these in nature yet. We saw them in fits and starts. They were there at the Somme in their debut, and they're here at Passchendaele in successive use. But this was the first tank-led offensive. It contained a short but accurate artillery bombardment that was concentrated on eliminating those German guns. When the full attack occurred on the 20th of November, the enemy was quite surprised because most of the infantry, as I say, had really stopped their offensives. The attack was followed with an infantry assault, and the 324 tanks managed to crush and smash through the enemy barbed wire. It was relatively successful. The British troops took about 3 miles or 5 kilometers in the assault, and they only lost 5,000 men, which was quite a shadow compared to the some 70,000 men that they had lost taking the objectives towards Passchendaele. The problem they faced, however, was that there were insufficient infantry reserves to consolidate the opening, and of course German attacks from the stormtroopers were able to quickly recover the lost ground. But it's notable to say this because despite the casualties the British were facing, and of course losing this ground by early December, this actually showed some promise for the tanks, and especially where they were combined with artillery and infantry. And we're going to see when we enter 1918, the final year of the war, a consolidation of tactics and plans the British were finally going to put to use under the name Combined Arms. It is also worth quickly considering the reaction that had occurred at home. We've not really talked much about the situation in Britain, but this was quite a notable one because, as I say, this was the biggest attritional campaign since the Somme, and many of the politicians had hoped the generals and soldiers had learned from their initial mishaps and failures that had occurred in the previous year. For Lloyd George, he did not consider it anyway a success. In fact, he outright called it a disaster. In some ways, the greatest disaster of the entire war so far. He heavily criticized Haig because what they had achieved, that minimal 3 miles, no more than 5 if we count what had happened with Cambrai. He believed it was a sacrifice of men that was so large in number that it did not justify it because of how minimal the territorial gains actually were. I mean, he was so furious, he actually did not want the attritional campaign to continue, because once again they proved very costly, and the war had not ended how Haig had promised that it would have done by achieving a supposed breakthrough. However, reporting in the papers was somewhat more mixed. In fact, quite a few saw it as a success. For instance, one extract from the Times, releasing in December 1917, went as far as to claim the German defences were broken and that public support should rally behind Haig because he is the man who is going to win the war. Quite a bold statement to say when you have over 70,000 men who have died once again in a campaign, and it's worth noting nearly 200,000 more were wounded and effectively casualties as well. However, when we look at the German side, there actually is some merit to say this. Once again, they had sustained a heavy attritional cost, very like the Somme and Verdun in 1916. They had lost around 220,000 soldiers. However, unlike at the Somme, they now had very little ground to actually retreat into. That massive concession of space they did when they formed the Hindenburg Line could not be done now. Yes, the defense in depth tactics were working, but they were going to reach their limit. There was only so much ground you could give before you would have to try and hold the line again and not secede so much space. Plus, as well, we shouldn't forget that Plumer's bite and hold tactic had worked. Just imagine if they had committed to that right at the start back in July into August, rather than wasting those summer months and actually achieved all their objectives in taking the railways. One final thing to note as well is there was now, of course, word coming in from the American support. We've not talked about America much since way back in our immediate causes lessons, but it's important to remember they're still here. We're going to have a bit of extra knowledge to add about them when we get into 1918 because a lot's been happening for America in 1917. A lot of American support is going to come to Britain's aid once we get into 1918. Haig's dreams of that promised idyllic breakthrough against the once impregnable German defences would finally appear, albeit to get to that point in 1918, it had come at a heavy cost to achieve it. So let us wrap things up now in regards to this Passchendaele campaign and how exactly it had gone for the British. Well, first off, this initially focused too much on a breakthrough. As we said, this was too much like the Somme. Instead of focusing on small objectives, they focused too heavily on the grand breakthrough. Instead of smashing the German lines and achieving absolute victory. Is it fair to say that maybe it's more like the Somme in that regard? Were they making the same mistakes that they made on those first few days and weeks look at that offensive? It's also worth noting, I mean, we have to refer to the generals here. They can't control the weather. There was some bad, bad rain, the worst the area had seen in years, and it had made a massive quagmire. They hadn't really anticipated their artillery would destroy the sewage system, only worsening the terrain. But all the same, it had happened and really hindered the progress that these series of campaigns and attacks into Passchendaele were trying to achieve. However, the bite and hold tactic was becoming stronger, much more fluid. That clockwork idea of flowing at pace was really coming to the fore now. It was having its setbacks in August, in September, and of course with the bad weather in October, but it was succeeding all the same. It's also worth remembering that we do have support coming from our Dominion troops as well, the Canadians and Australians especially. Again, we can't overlook these. Britain's a wider empire at this time, and they're having assistance from these armies that, again, are not cold in the way the initial BAF were in those early years of the campaign. They're still relatively professional in nature, they're well trained, and they're really experienced. We're going to get into two key leaders in 1918 who really come to the fore, Arthur Currie and John Monash. So feel free if you want ahead of time, do a bit of reading, a bit of brushing up about them, and prepare yourselves who they are. But the final part is the campaign was attritional in nature. Thousands of casualties were suffered with only a few miles of land to be gained at a time. And it's worth calling back that initial thesis we mentioned with the Somme campaign. Do we remember Alan Clark? His idea the generals were donkeys leading the lions of the men into battle? Is this a fair assumption to make? Because again, the attritional campaign is still costing those thousands of lives. They're struggling to really find a better way to achieve their victories. There are heavy costs involved, and as one historian said, are these really acceptable losses for what they are gaining? Well, as we'll see in my following series, when we go into the Battle of Amiens and the Hundred Days Offensive in 1918, perhaps many will consider it worthwhile and an acceptable loss once absolute victory is secured. But as said, we'll get onto that in my following lesson. Thank you, as always, for taking part in this one. I hope you found it insightful, found it useful. As always, if you want to expand your knowledge on the topic of Passchendaele further, do check out my description box below, where I'll leave a few of the readings that I've used when designing these lessons. So thank you once again. I look forward to seeing you in class for my following series. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.